New Year! Welcome to 2020. Anytime a new year, especially when it's a year like 2020, it sounds cool like that. You want to kind of introduce some fresh new ideas. 2020 vision, right? But I don't know, I kind of like how last year went. So, a lot of things are probably going to continue like that, quite honestly. But here's something I did over the break. And it'll be a fruitful topic for today and probably on through a good portion of the semester. I wanted to read a certain book. It is by Nabeel Qureshi. He was a speaker for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, especially on the subject of Islam. And his book is called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And Allah, as you might know, is the Arabic title for God, and typically refers to the God that the Muslims worship. The rest of this time is just going to be dedicated to this book, to kind of summarizing his message, his journey. So, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. Nabeel Qureshi had a fascinating life. He grew up in America and Pakistan and England. Now, that alone is pretty interesting. Now, something that struck me about the book, I knew he was a really gracious guy, just from his talks that I've seen. But the connection with people that goes behind that is pretty striking. And that connection is not strong with anybody more than his own family. So he grew up in a Ahmadi Muslim family, which is a denomination of Islam, a real small denomination. Two main ones, of course, are the Sunnis and the Shiites. There's a few smaller ones. He referred to his parents as Abba and Ami. It's a very affectionate kind of term. And that affection for his family is undying through the book. When he was growing up as a Muslim, he felt just a close connection with his family, and his family was very caring toward him. They taught rituals of prayer and just lived a clean and respectable lifestyle, very peaceful, and seemed to raise him as a family should. So a great upbringing, very connected with his Islamic roots and his family. Wound up going to college at Old Dominion. I believe that's in Virginia. And this guy is brilliant. I knew that when I would listen to his talks, understanding his young age. He ended up saying that him and his friend were 2 of the 6 students at Old Dominion to win this prestigious award to the highest in academics. It certainly only got more brilliant from there. And he was going to be a medical doctor. The family also was looking forward to him being a medical doctor. In Islamic culture, when your child does something great, like becomes a medical doctor, it sheds a great light on the family. Family respectability is kind of raised as the child goes on to do great things like that. So they're definitely behind this idea. He also joined the forensic team at Old Dominion, and that's where he met his friend David. David Wood might be a name that rings a bell if you're in the know in Christian apologetics. So they're on this forensics team. David Wood, at this point, is like a recent convert to Christianity out of atheism. So they're on this team together, and they start joking around, and they just hit it off. So they hang together, they room together, and eventually start having conversations about Christianity, Islam. And at this point, David's not really that confident in his faith, and he does not know all these facts about Islam and Christianity. But he's passionate, he's got a goal in mind, and he starts having some meaningful, deep conversations about the nature of God, the nature of Christ, with Nabeel. And so Nabeel, in Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, chronicles kind of how these conversations go, and especially focuses in on his time at Old Dominion and going back and forth with David and a few acquaintances that David had, like Mike Lacona and Gary Habermas. So a good portion deals with these arguments that David would come at him with, or Nabeel would go at David with some arguments. And being friends, they learned how they could butt heads and clash and argue, and even raise their voices a little bit, and still come back around and be friends. Come back the next day, put down the swords, and joke around again. So you have these intermittent times of joking, how they would mess with each other, or how they would make fun of the professor during class. That behavior's not recommended, UNM students. But those are side issues. The Trinity, to a Muslim, is completely unthinkable. It's the sin of shirk. And the Quran says, say not 3. It's calling the Christians, don't say 3 anymore, God is 1. So they consider Christians to be polytheists because of this Trinitarian doctrine, and maybe a misunderstanding of the Trinitarian doctrine. So they're sitting in a class. For some reason, they have the same class. David's on a completely different major, but they would try to take classes together. So they're in organic chemistry. And this just soon after they have arguments about the Trinity. Nabeel's sitting in class, and he sees a picture of a molecule of nitrate. So you have these resonant structures. Chemists have a way of denoting the different resonant structures depending on how the electrons are distributed in that molecule. And the professor says that one molecule of nitrate is all three resonance structures all the time and never just one of them. The three are separate but all the same and are one. They are three in one. Well, how interesting. Now, this didn't convince Nabeel of the Trinity, but it gave him something to think about. It made it so that it wasn't automatically an illogical idea. They also, of course, disagree about the nature of Jesus. If you disagree about the nature of the Trinity, you're going to disagree about the nature of Jesus. Of course, any good Muslim is going to say that God has no son, as it says in the Quran, and they may even look into the Gospels. Now, they believe that the Gospels were a word sent from God. They just don't believe that they're really preserved all that accurately. More on that in a minute. So in the Gospels, they will even say that the things that Jesus said, none of that states that he believed himself to be God, or any different from a mere human. At the same time, Muslims do believe that Jesus is a Messiah, that is, a messenger of God. So there'll be agreement in the term Messiah, but they would not agree on what it meant to be Messiah. So they disagree on the nature of Jesus. They disagree about what Jesus came to do. Christians will say, well, he came to die the death on the cross. Muslims say no. In the 4th Surah, 157, it says that Jesus did not die on the cross. There's a couple theories about this, and Nabeel gave some mention of the swoon theory, minority theory among Muslims, certainly. Swoon theory being that Jesus was hurt badly, but didn't actually die. The more common Muslim perspective is that Jesus was replaced. It wasn't Jesus, it was Judas who was put up there, and Jesus went off free. And the Gospels even say, look, Jesus is alive, he's not dead. And now the Quran agrees that the ascension happened. Jesus was taken to God, but was taken up without dying, kind of like Enoch. So Nabeel would battle with David over that issue also, and would battle over the reliability of the New Testament versus the Quran. Any good Muslim is going to be taught that the New Testament was corrupted. Paul, certainly an intruder, and the documents from the New Testament were manipulated by the early church, by the early governmental authorities to introduce things that Jesus never would have said. Now, could the same argument be made about the Quran? And Nabeel goes on to admit, I realized the standard I was holding the Bible to was a very different standard than what I applied to my own beliefs. So he's holding this scrutiny, really without any good evidence, against the New Testament, and was unwilling to hold that same type of scrutiny against the Quran. When he did, it kind of disturbed him, what he realized. It was interesting to look at the point where they really agreed. In one of the classes, there was a girl who was declaring herself to be an atheist, or maybe agnostic. And of course, David and Nabeel are sitting together, and they start to argue with the girl. One from a Muslim background, one from a Christian background. They're both saying, are you kidding me? You don't believe in God? Well, look at this. Well, ironically, it turns out that David ended up marrying that girl. She became a theist just a few days after that, and a Christian after that, and David married her. But how interesting that Muslims and Christians share a lot of the same arguments for God. Nabeel and David didn't just talk about arguments against Christianity, but arguments in favor of Islam, and why Nabeel was so dead set on remaining a faithful Muslim. The core thing to prove for Islam is the Shahada, the declaration that makes a person a Muslim, that there is no God but God, or no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. That is the declaration. So those are the things to be proven. Right, attached to that, not included in the Shahada, but close to that in importance, is the inspiration and reliability of the Quran. So one of the positive arguments that Nabeel sought to prove is that the Quran itself is a sign of Allah's truth, that it is a reliable document that bears marks of being the very words of God. And part of the core of this argument is the claim that nobody can duplicate what is written in the Quran. Nobody can write anything similar in beauty as to what is written in the Quran. A very subjective sort of proof, and one that really restricts to those who are Arabic speaking. But the strongest thing that kept Nabeel attached to Islam was simply his tradition and his attachment with his family. He could not see himself breaking from this upbringing or breaking the hearts of those he loved so much and those who loved him so much. So in these times of confusion regarding why a certain argument didn't stand up so well in favor of Islam, he would always revert back to greater and greater commitments to prayer, even into teaching at the mosque more and more, and to inquiring from imams, that is, the teachers, the leaders of the mosque. Right along with that, the risk of turning from Islam was incredibly high. Like I said, with the family, but also with your own thoughts. So eventually there was some cognitive dissonance that he realized. He saw that evidence was not supporting Islam the way it was supporting Christian claims. And the things that he thought were so strong and so sure in his Islamic faith didn't seem to be built on such a strong foundation after all. While a Muslim, he even concluded that the certainty of the fact of the resurrection was about 85%. But he said that the validity of Islam was 100%, so he really couldn't consider the resurrection. He's admitting that there's a strong case to be made for Christianity, but these attachments he cannot break. And I don't know if I've ever heard of somebody so reluctant and so stubborn to come to a faith that he knew was true. But he would know a whole lot more even after this point, and would stay reluctant. His inquiry became more and more honest. And through honest inquiry, each argument in favor of Islam and against Christianity began to crumble. All it took was honest investigation. He found out that Jesus did claim to be more than a human. Why else did they try to crucify him? He even reverted to saying, hey, that's cheating if you use the book of John to show that Jesus thought himself to be more than a human. But then he found evidence in the book of Mark, thought to be the earliest gospel. And partly through his conversations with Mike Licona and Gary Habermas, he found out that the crucifixion and resurrection is the only thing that really makes good sense of the evidence. The account of his death on the cross, the blood and water coming out from his heart, the burial in the tomb, the empty tomb, the eyewitness accounts of him walking among the people after the empty tomb, and the ascension, the lifestyle change in the disciples, the coming of the Holy Spirit, and the willingness to die for what they could know for sure was a fact. It became insurmountable evidence in favor of the death and resurrection of Jesus, something that cannot be true if the Quran is true. And if it is true, then the Quran must not be true. He discovered New Testament reliability and saw that the Quran was a lot more questionable than what he had assumed all along. But it took an honest investigation of the manuscript evidence. And he had to question whether the Quran really does have the fingerprint of God. He says on page 229, quote, "The boldest argument for the divine inspiration of the Quran was its inimitability, primarily its literary excellence. No one can emulate its eloquence, other Muslims would say alongside me. Our argument stemmed from the Quran itself." Bear in mind, all along this time, he's trying to prove Islam correct. He's not trying to fight against it. He does not want it to be false. He wants Christianity to be false because he would have to give up so much. It would be like a death in him, and his vivid way of describing that highlights it. He found that there were some mistakes in the Quran. Does it really have the fingerprint of God? Why the mistakes? And why are there commands to do things that in my heart I know are deplorable behaviors? On page 234, he talks about the sequence of embryonic development. The Quran, I guess, explains it as though the bones form first and then skin goes over those bones, etc. He found out this doesn't describe an accurate development of an embryo, even though many Muslims will claim that the Quran has supernatural scientific knowledge within it. Nabeel also pointed out the instruction in the Quran that says that when you capture or kill a foreign soldier, go ahead and marry his wife. He could not reconcile that command, that instruction, with what he knew to be true. He cannot reconcile the idea that it both commands that and it is the perfect command of God. In fact, he visualized his own family in that situation, just to make it more vivid. So he was disturbed by the idea that the Quran maybe didn't have the fingerprint of God after all. We've got no God but God, Muhammad's his messenger, the Quran is his word. These three things have to be true for Islam to be true. The Quran one was crumbling. But he also had to ask, does Muhammad bear the signs of a unique prophet of God? He had always viewed Muhammad as an exemplary person, with no character defects, always giving us a good example to live by. But this is because certain things were glossed over or covered up or rewritten. And bear in mind that what we have about the life of Muhammad are not very reliable sources. It's called the Hadith, the writings that talk about Muhammad's life, and they generally come from 100 or 200 years after his life, and by word of mouth for a period of time. Makes you wonder if some things were left out or cleaned up. But these hadith stories still expose the highly questionable, even deplorable actions of Muhammad. And this disturbed Nabeel, so of course he wants to talk with his father about it or talk with well-educated imams about it. And he couldn't find any better responses than what he had already come up with as responses. Unsatisfactory, sometimes ignoring the facts, ignoring the evidence. He says on page 217, quote, "It did not take long for me to realize that the Muhammad I had come to know was a filtered version. Honestly, it took me about 30 seconds." End quote. So he's investigating more and more about what the hadith describe about the life of Muhammad. And he goes on to say, same page, quote, "In an instant, the hadith shattered my illusion of familiarity with Muhammad." The next chapter, he goes on to describe more. He's reading from volume 1 of the third hadith, 124. And Muhammad's instructed to fight against people who are unbelievers, or unbelievers in Islam. And Nabeel couldn't believe it. He said, quote, "Muhammad was saying that he would fight people until they became Muslim or until he killed them and took their property. That was impossible. It ran counter to everything I knew about Muhammad, and it contradicted the Quran's clear statement that there is no compulsion in religion." And again, he wanted to find resolution to these to affirm his Islamic faith, but in all honesty, he couldn't do so. Going to the experts, he couldn't do so. So he knew God was real, but he started to see that the Quran maybe didn't have the fingerprint of God, and Muhammad didn't really look to be the character of a wonderful prophet of God either. This hurt. This wasn't easy for him to come up with. This was miserable. This was a miserable time of life over the next year plus. He fought it for months and months. He was not willing to bank that much on his Islamic faith being false or the Christian faith being true. This again is cognitive dissonance. What you see as facts, as reality, is not what you try to tell yourself to believe. So he wrestled and he wrestled. Wouldn't always let other people know that he was wrestling to such an extent. And he continued praying prayers like, "God, I really don't know who you are anymore, but I want to know." And he asked God to give him dreams and visions to tell him what he was supposed to do. So he's hanging out with his dad down in Orlando, and he's so disturbed, he waits for his dad to go to sleep, and then he sits on the edge of his bed and prays. And he's brought to a vision. He sees a field of crosses. Plain as day, not a whole lot of explanation to it. Clearly a sign of Christian faith. Okay, well that's just a vision. Could be a lack of sleep induced. God, you're going to have to do more. He ends up having a dream. He actually has 3 dreams. God refused to give him more. In the first dream, a cricket bites the head off an iguana. This iguana is chilling on top of a pillar, then comes down and crushes this little boy and is going to bite and kill the little boy. Cricket comes, bites the head off the iguana. Interesting. Not super clear, maybe? Okay, a second dream. There's a narrow door, like a concrete or brick door, leading into this big banquet. Bear in mind, Nabeel's never read about the wedding banquet in the Bible and what it means. But he sees this banquet and his friend David Wood standing in the door, and Nabeel can't go in. He said, "What's going on? How come I can't come in?" And David says, "You never responded to the invitation." Okay, that one's getting pretty clear, especially when you look at what a banquet is and the narrow door, biblically speaking. Okay, 2 dreams wasn't enough. He demanded a third dream, and a third dream came. And he's on stairs leading out of a mosque. He can't go up the stairs. There are those behind him. And the stairs leading out of the mosque seemed very clear to David and Nabeel that it represented leaving Islam. That was consistently God's command and instruction in each of the 3 dreams, as well as the vision. But he wouldn't convert just yet. He was stubborn, and he was stubborn because of his devotion to his tradition, his upbringing, his family. So again, he says, "God, I want to know you." He had to be brought to the point where he said, "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll forsake whatever it takes. I just need to know who you really are, what I really need to do." I think for a long time he knew what he had to do. He just couldn't bring himself to the point where his will would trump his emotional attachment and his fears. So Nabeel dives into the Word, starts reading the book of Matthew in the New Testament, and soon comes across a verse in Matthew 5 that says, "Blessed are the mourners, for they shall be comforted." Here he was in a serious point of mourning, and he hears this verse, and he begins to realize, oh my gosh, this is feeding my soul. He could feel himself come alive. Like these lights coming on inside him. He's understanding things. He's having his soul spoken to by what he's reading in Matthew and as he darted around the Bible to cross-reference things. He became so hungry for the Word, for the teachings of the New Testament, that here he was at med school, day one of classes, very important time. Those classes were an afterthought, because he said the Bible was, quote, his lifeline. Like, he could not live without this. This is causing him to come out of his mourning and come into life. He's beginning to realize who God is that he's been seeking and asking for all along. Didn't convert just yet, but probably knew more Bible than a lot of Christians know by the time he did. And finally, on August 24th, 2005, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, puts his face to the floor and prays this prayer. I submit that Jesus Christ is Lord of heaven and earth. He came to this world to die for my sins, proving his lordship by rising from the dead. I am a sinner, and I need him for redemption. Christ, I accept you into my life. Admittedly, he didn't know the power of the gospel or what that would mean. And he would go on and live a faithful life. The body of the book pretty much ends there, but there's some people, including Nabeel, they shed some light on what would happen after that. He'd go through med school, but that's not really what he was called to do. He was called to reach out to others. He eventually joined Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, their speaking team, would do some debates and some talks on the topic, and he would get an education at Biola, Oxford, a couple other places. Loved to learn, loved apologetics, loved Muslims, loved his family. And bear in mind, he's doing a lot of this just in his 20s. And then he got stomach cancer a few years ago. He continued putting up some YouTube videos from the hospital that continued to exhibit his love and his faithfulness. So I remember Nabeel as someone who's faithful to the end, who shows the glory of God in life and in death. He was so confident, even from a hospital bed, confident in his faith, confident where he would go, confident that through everything that he had researched, everything that he had known from his time of honest investigation, he knew he was going to be with God, that he had the facts straight. He knew who the Lord was, a new, fresh, personal way of knowing God through his confession of Jesus. He was so peaceful. He was concerned about others, even from the hospital bed. He wasn't concerned about his own stage 4 cancer. He was concerned about what would be going on with his family. He was still concerned with reaching out, sharing the light of Christ with those from Muslim backgrounds. And you may remember the day, or that time, Nabeel died on September 16th, 2017, from the stomach cancer. He was only 34. God didn't do a miracle to heal him, and God didn't have to. God did the miracle in him before that point. Here's what he says, page 283, toward the end of the book. After loving us with the most humble life and the most horrific death, Jesus told us, "As I have loved you, go and love one another." How could I consider myself a follower of Jesus if I was not willing to live as he lived, to die as he died, to love the unloved, and give hope to the hopeless? I think a lot of us can learn from his story, willing to forsake everything we thought we knew in order to know God truly, follow him honestly. So this is a review of Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. Please consider what it means. I'm thankful to God for the testimony and the exemplary life and the knowledge and wisdom of Nabeel Qureshi. I hope you can grow from his message and learn what it means to investigate your faith honestly, to follow it with grace and hunger and passion. We'll dive more into the nuances of some of these arguments going forward. Until then, may God bless and guide you.